The station above Kepler 22b was not built for humans. The ceilings were too high, the air was too thin in some corridors, and too thick in others, and the lights pulsed at a frequency that gave most human visitors a dull headache after a few hours. Ambassador Laura Vane had worked there for 3 years, and she had never once complained about any of it. She kept a small bottle of headache pills in her desk drawer, a photograph of her dog on the wall, and a habit of arriving 30 minutes early to every meeting. That was how she worked. Quietly, thoroughly, without fuss. On the morning the tribute demand arrived, Laura was already at her desk with a cup of coffee, reading through trade reports from the outer colonies. The message came in through the official diplomatic channel, flagged with the gold seal of the Galactic Convergence Council. She set down her coffee, opened the document, and began to read. It took her 2.5 hours to get through all of it. The document was 12,000 lines long. It was written in the formal language of the Council, which was dense and slow and full of phrases that sounded polite but meant something cutting. Laura had learned to read it the way a person learns to read a contract, carefully, without getting distracted by the pretty words, looking only for what it was actually saying. What it was actually saying was this: humanity would give up 30% of everything it produced across its colonies. It would hand over 4 settled worlds in the outer ring. It would agree to never expand its military without permission from the Council. And it would do all of this as a tithe, a payment, to something called the Collective Stability Fund, which, as far as Laura could tell after careful reading, was simply a fund controlled entirely by the elder species. She read it a second time to make sure she had understood it correctly. She had. Then she looked out the narrow window beside her desk at the blue-white glow of the planet below and sat quietly for a moment. Councillor Orvan came to her office at noon. He was Vreth, which meant he was tall, gray-skinned. He carried himself the way very old institutions carry themselves, with a kind of calm certainty that things would go the way they had always gone, because they always had. He asked her if she had received the document. She said she had. He asked if she had any questions about the language or the terms. She said no. The language was quite clear. He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they expect the next words to be the beginning of a negotiation. Laura thanked him for coming. She offered him a seat, which the shape of his body made impossible, so he declined politely. She walked him to the door. She said she would be in touch. He left. She sat back down, pulled a small communicator from her desk, and sent a single encrypted message to Earth. It was 4 sentences long. It described the document. It described the terms. It ended with a line that said, "Awaiting your guidance, no action taken yet." Then she went back to her trade reports. The Council had not expected that. They had expected her to call an emergency meeting. They had expected raised voices, or at minimum, a request for an extension on the response deadline. Junior species always did one of those things. They panicked, or they begged for time, or they tried to begin negotiating right away from a position of total weakness, which was exactly the position the Council wanted them in. Laura did none of those things. She finished her work, ate dinner alone in the station cafeteria, called her sister back in Tucson on a personal channel, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. On Earth, in a long, low building in Colorado Springs that had no sign on its exterior, 2 people read Laura's message at the same table. One was Colonel Pete Darrow, who was 44 years old, from a small town in Ohio, and who had the kind of face that never showed what he was thinking. The other was Fleet Admiral Grace Colton, who was 51, from Savannah, Georgia, and who had commanded 3 different carrier groups before she ended up behind a desk. Grace was the kind of person who always looked slightly amused, as if she knew something you didn't. Pete read the message first. Then Grace read it. Grace poured herself a glass of water. Pete leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Neither of them said anything dramatic. There was no alarm, no urgent phone calls to the president's office in the middle of the night. At least, not yet. They talked for a little over an hour, calmly and specifically, the way people talk when they have already thought about a problem before it arrived. Because the truth was, they had thought about it. Not this exact document, not these exact terms, but something like this. Humanity had been growing fast. It had been quiet about how fast, but it had been growing. New colonies, new ships, new contacts in deep space that it had not reported to the Council yet, because the Council had not asked, and humanity had not volunteered the information. Not because humanity was hiding anything, exactly. More, the way a careful person doesn't lay out everything on the table in the first 5 minutes of a meeting. Grace said that the Council had probably been watching the growth numbers and gotten nervous. Pete said that made sense. Grace said the question was what humanity wanted the next 10 years to look like. Pete said he thought he already knew the answer to that. They agreed on a course of action before they left the room. It was not a dramatic course of action. It did not involve warships moving into position or emergency broadcasts to the colonies. It was something. It would not beg. It would not begin negotiating from weakness. It would think carefully, as it always did when something truly mattered, and it would respond when it was ready. Back on the station, Laura Vane took her headache pill at 8:30, as she did every night, and read a book until she fell asleep. Outside her small window, the stars were very still. The Council had set a response deadline of 30 days. It was a generous deadline, or so they believed. Most species, when handed a demand of that size, responded within 48 hours, because the anxiety of holding the thing was worse than anything the response could cost them. The elder species had learned that over centuries. Pressure, properly applied, produced movement, and movement, directed correctly, produced compliance. Humanity did not move. On the first day after the demand was delivered, there was nothing from Earth. No message, no request for clarification, no diplomatic signal of any kind. The Council's communication team logged the silence and assumed humanity was drafting a response. On the third day, there was still nothing. The team flagged it to Counselor Orvan, who told them it was not unusual. Junior species sometimes needed time to process the scale of what they were being asked. On the seventh day, a junior analyst named Veek, a young Soloon whose crystalline body flickered soft yellow when she was nervous, submitted a report, noting that not only had Earth not responded to the demand, but human trade ships were continuing their routes completely normally. Supply runs to outer colonies, cargo transfers at neutral stations, a passenger liner that had stopped at the station above Kepler 22b to refuel, whose crew were cheerful and unhurried, and seemed to have no idea that anything unusual was happening. Orvan read the report and did not find it alarming exactly, but he did find it strange. On the 11th day, Laura Vane sent a short personal message to Orvan's office, saying she had been meaning to ask whether the Council dining hall had changed its schedule, because she had missed lunch twice that week. He passed it to his assistant, who passed it to the Council's behavioral analyst, a Dravith academic named Pren, who read it very carefully, and then said he was not sure what to make of it. The silence from humanity was not like the silence of a species that was afraid. Afraid species went quiet in a specific way. Their trade slowed, their border patrols tightened, their public communications became careful and scripted. Humanity's silence was different. Their trade was the same. Their border activity was the same. Their public communications, which Pren had been monitoring, were full of the ordinary things: sports results, local politics, complaints about weather, announcements about festivals. A city in a place called Oregon had held a food fair. A singer from a place called Nashville had released a new album. None of it suggested a civilization that knew it was in the middle of an ultimatum. Either they were extraordinarily good at pretending nothing was wrong, or nothing actually felt wrong to them. Pren filed a report to the full council that was, for a Draveth academic, unusually short. It said, "Recommend caution. This species does not appear to be processing the demand the way we expected." The council met in closed session on the 12th day. The 17 representatives sat in their designated spaces in the great circular chamber, their various environmental systems humming at different pitches. They argued for 4 hours. The Vreth said humanity was stalling, and that the council should make the next move to apply more pressure. The Pale Mouth, the Draveth elder who had sat on the council longer than some species had been in space, said nothing for the entire 4 hours, which was unusual enough that several representatives kept glancing at it. At the end of the session, Orvan sent a formal message to Laura Vane's office, asking if humanity had any questions about the document or the timeline. She replied within the hour. She said the document had been very clear, and that she would have a formal response for the council shortly. She thanked him for checking in. She was not stalling. She was not afraid. She was waiting for a message from Earth, and the message from Earth was waiting on one person, Dr. Owen Briggs, a quiet, thin man from Portland, who wore the same gray sweater almost every day, and who had not left his office in 11 days. Owen was not a diplomat or a soldier. He was an astrophysicist who had spent the last decade doing something that most people at the council would have found impossible to believe: mapping space. Not the space humanity had been given access to, not the jump lanes the council controlled. The other space, the unmapped sections, the long dark routes between star systems that the council had never charted because they were slow and difficult, and the elder species had their fast roads and had seen no reason to bother with the slow ones. Owen had bothered. His team had bothered. They had been bothering for 10 years, one careful survey at a time, and they had nearly finished. He finished on the night of the 12th day. He sent the completed files to Grace Colton's office. Grace stayed up until 3 in the morning reading through the data. Then she called Pete Darrow. Pete answered on the second ring. Grace said, "It's done." Pete said, "All of it?" Grace said, 71%. More than enough. Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell Laura." Grace sent the files to Laura's communicator on the station above Kepler 22b. Laura received them at 6 in the morning, station time. She was already awake. She read through the files over breakfast. She read them again while she got dressed. She thought about what she was going to say, and then she decided she wasn't going to say very much at all. She sent a message to Orvan's office. She said she was ready to... Orvan confirmed within minutes. The request to have the full chamber present was unusual. Most responses were delivered to a small committee, but he granted it without asking why. He assumed it would be the beginning of a negotiation. The council chamber was quiet when Laura Vane walked in. All 17 species were present. Their various environmental suits and atmospheric enclosures made the room sound like a machine room. Soft hisses, gentle hums, the occasional low click from one of the Draveth. The walls were pale and high and curved, and the lighting was the kind that showed everything clearly and hid nothing. 17 sets of eyes, or the things that functioned as eyes, followed Laura as she crossed the floor alone. She had no staff with her, no legal counsel, no aide carrying documents. She wore a plain navy uniform with a small flag pin on her collar, and she carried a single data pad, which she set down on the podium without opening. Councillor Orvan welcomed her on behalf of the council. He noted formally that this was humanity's official response session and asked her to proceed when she was ready. Laura looked out at the assembled representatives. She did not look nervous. She did not look angry, either. She looked the way a person looks when they are about to say something they have thought about very carefully. She said, "No." The chamber went still. Not just quiet, still. The hisses and hums did not stop, because the machines did not stop, but the living things in the room became very, very motionless. Counselor Orvan's suit vented a small burst of stress gas that he clearly did not intend. The Saloon analyst Veek, seated in the observer gallery, flickered through a rapid series of colors, violet, orange, white, before she got herself under control. The pale mouth, who had not leaned forward in living memory, leaned forward. Orvan, very carefully, asked Laura if she understood what she was saying. She said she did. He asked if humanity understood that the Council administered 60% of all active jump lane infrastructure in the settled galaxy, and that a refusal of this nature could result in significant restrictions on humanity's access to those lanes. She said she understood that. He asked if humanity understood that several council members maintained military fleets whose combined size was many times larger than anything humanity had ever built. She said she understood that too. Then he said, slowly, that he wanted to make sure the council was hearing this correctly, because the word she had used was very short, and he wanted to be certain it meant what he thought it meant. Laura reached over, picked up the datapad, and slid it across the surface of the podium toward the council's central display panel. She asked them to read what was on it before they continued the conversation. The document loaded onto the chamber's shared screen. It was long, but not 12,000 lines long. It was specific. It was written in plain language, and it had been put together by two people, Dr. Owen Briggs, the astrophysicist from Portland, and Dr. Nadia Flores, a strategic analyst from San Antonio, who was small and dark-eyed and had the habit of writing things so clearly that people sometimes found them uncomfortable to read. It took a while. The document explained in calm and precise language what humanity had been doing for the last 10 years. It had been mapping jump lane space, not the council-controlled lanes, but the old, slow, unmapped routes between stars that nobody had bothered to chart. Humanity had charted 71% of them. The remaining 29% were already partially surveyed and would be complete within 18 months. What this meant in practical terms was that humanity could move its ships, its cargo, and its people across the galaxy without using a single council-controlled road. The document also noted, in a section that several council members read 3 times, that humanity had established 17 resupply stations in deep space over the past 8 years, positioned along those new routes. These stations were outside council jurisdiction. They were fully staffed and fully supplied. Further into the document, there was a section about propulsion. Human engineers, a team led by a young man named Ray Caldwell from Houston, who was 29 years old and had been working on the problem since graduate school, had developed a propulsion variant that did not rely on the resonance beacons that the council used to make its jump lanes function. It was slower over short distances. Over long distances, it was comparable, and it used none of the infrastructure the council controlled. The last section was what Nadia Flores had added herself, almost as a footnote. It mentioned briefly that in the course of mapping unmapped space, human survey teams had made contact with 4 species that were not members of the Galactic Convergence Council. These species were, as the document put it, quite interested in new trading partnerships. Their home systems were located along the new human-charted routes. Their combined economic output was substantial. One of them, a species that humanity had been calling the Cathari until they learned the species' actual name, had already signed a preliminary trade agreement with a human outer colony. Laura stood at the podium and let them read. She did not say anything. She had a glass of water on the edge of the podium, and she drank from it once while she waited. When the room finally began to shift and murmur, Orvan looked at her with an expression that his suit was not designed to hide. It was not anger. It was something older and more genuine than anger. It was the expression of someone who had just realized they had made an error in calculation that had been running quietly for 10 years. Laura said gently that she wanted to be clear about one thing. Humanity was not trying to be difficult. It was not interested in conflict. It had no desire to disrupt the Council or destabilize the galaxy. All it was saying, with one word and one document, was that it had a choice. It had always had a choice. It just hadn't said so until now. For 3 days, after Laura delivered her response, the council chamber was closed to everyone except full members. No observers, no staff, no record of the proceedings made available through the standard channels. Councillor Orvan's office cancelled all his public appointments and sent a polite note saying he was occupied with internal council business. The saloon representatives stopped appearing in the station's shared common areas. Even the station's cleaning staff noticed that the big circular chamber was lit late into every night. Inside, the 17 species argued. The Vreth wanted to move forward with the threatened restrictions on jump lane access. They had said humanity couldn't use the lanes, and they felt that backing away from that would make the council look weak. The Saloon said that before anyone did anything, they should perhaps look more carefully at how much of their own manufacturing supply chain ran through human outer colonies. Because upon reviewing the numbers, which they had only just properly reviewed, the answer was uncomfortable. A full trade disruption with humanity would cost the Saloon more than it would cost humans, possibly considerably more. The Pale Mouth spoke on the second day. It spoke for a long time, in the slow, deliberate way that Dravith elders spoke, which meant that every sentence was a complete thought and none of them were wasted. It said that the council had made an error, not a moral error necessarily, though that could be discussed separately, a strategic error. It had assumed that because humanity was young, humanity was weak. It had confused the two things. Youth and weakness were not the same. In fact, in the Draveth's experience, the youngest species in the galaxy were often the most dangerous, not because they were powerful, but because they were not yet afraid of what power costs. The Pale Mouth said the council had two options. It could push forward with the restrictions and the threats, and learn very quickly how serious humanity was about its alternatives. Or it could take the next few weeks to genuinely understand what it was dealing with, and then make a decision from a more informed position. Nobody argued with the Pale Mouth when it spoke like that. On Earth, Pete Darrow and Grace Colton were doing the same kind of quiet, specific work they always did. Grace had moved 2 carrier groups, not to council space, not anywhere that looked threatening, but to a position that was jump-capable within a few hours. She described it to her staff as routine repositioning. It was routine in the sense that she had been planning it for 2 years. But she did not mention that. Pete had written what he called a contingency file. It was a collection of prepared orders that could be sent to human ships, colonies, and stations in the event that the Council followed through on its threats. The orders were not aggressive. They were logistical, rerouting cargo through the new unmapped lanes, activating the deep space resupply stations, initiating the new trade agreements with the Ketheri and the 3 other non-council species. None of it required firing a single weapon. The file was, as Pete described it to his aide, a plan for living without the council, not a plan for fighting it. His aide, a young woman named Dana Cole from Minneapolis, read through the file one afternoon and said it seemed like the plan had been ready for a while. Pete said he liked to think ahead. On the station, Laura Vane had very little official work to do during those 3 days. The council was in closed session, which meant she was simply waiting. She used the time to catch up on reports she had been putting off, to take a long walk around the outer ring of the station where the gravity was slightly lower and the view of space was clearest, and to have several video calls with people back home. One was a strategy call with Nadia Flores, who asked how the council was reacting, and listened carefully to Laura's answer. One was a check-in with Owen Briggs, who had finally left his office and was apparently spending a few days hiking somewhere in the mountains outside Portland, but who had his communicator with him and was reachable. The third call was with her brother Dan, back in Tucson, who asked how work was going. Laura said it was going all right. A little complicated, but manageable. Dan asked if she was eating properly. She said she was. He told her about a problem with his car, and she listened and gave him the advice their father would have given, which was to take it to someone who actually knew what they were doing. They talked for 40 minutes about nothing important at all, and Laura felt better afterward. On the third night, Counselor Orvan sent her a message. It was short. He asked if she would be available for a private meeting the following morning, outside the formal chamber. Just the two of them. She replied that she would be happy to meet. They sat across from each other in a small room off the main corridor that was sometimes used for informal conversations. Orvan's suit hissed softly. Laura had her coffee. He told her without ceremony that he had been on the council for over 200 years, and in that time he had seen many species respond to pressure. He had never seen a response like humanity's. She asked him what he meant. He said he meant the combination, the preparation, the calm, and the willingness to say one word and mean it completely. Laura thought about that for a moment. Then she said that humans had spent a very long time on one planet, in reach of each other, and that on a small planet with no exit, you learned quickly that the only way to survive long-term was to mean what you said. That you could not afford to bluff forever when the other person was right across the table. Orvan was quiet for a while after that. Then he said he thought the council was going to revise its position. Laura thanked him and finished her coffee. The official notification came 22 days after Laura had stood at the podium and said her single word. It arrived in the same format as the original tribute demand, a long, formal document with the gold seal of the Galactic Convergence Council, written in the dense, slow language of galactic diplomacy. It was 8,000 lines long. Laura poured herself a cup of coffee before she started reading, because she knew what it was going to say, and she wanted to enjoy the experience of reading it properly. It said, across 8,000 lines, that the Council had reviewed the geopolitical landscape of the current period, had considered the emerging strategic dynamics of the outer systems, and had concluded that a revised approach to interspecies resource frameworks would better serve the long-term interests of collective galactic stability. The tribute demand was being withdrawn. In its place, the Council proposed a new set of mutual cooperation guidelines that would be discussed in open session, with full input from all member species, including humanity. 8,000 lines, and the core of it could have fit in 2 sentences. The Council had miscalculated, and it was backing away. It was doing so in the most elaborate and face-saving manner possible, which was exactly what Laura had expected, and she read every line with a patient expression and a slight curve at the corner of her mouth. She drafted a response that was 200 lines, very short by Council standards. She said humanity was pleased to receive the revised framework, and looked forward to open and productive discussions. She used exactly the kind of warm, formal language the Council expected, because there was no reason to embarrass anyone. She sent it, set down her pen, and felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of a job that had been done the right way. The open session was held a week later. All 17 species were present, plus Laura, plus 2 people who had traveled from Earth for the occasion. Owen Briggs, who showed up in a clean version of his usual gray sweater, and sat quietly in the observer section, reviewing notes. And Nadia Flores, who wore a dark blazer and spent most of the session watching the room rather than the speaker's podium, because she found people more interesting than speeches. The session lasted most of the day. The new cooperative framework that came out of it was nothing like the tribute demand. It was an actual partnership. Contributions from multiple species, oversight shared across members, terms that could be renegotiated on a set schedule. Humanity's input was incorporated fully. When the final text was agreed upon, Laura signed it on behalf of Earth, and Counselor Orvon signed on behalf of the Council. And then they shook hands, which was something he had learned to do during his years working alongside humans, and had quietly practiced on occasions like this. He told her that he hoped the relationship between humanity and the Council would be a productive one going forward. She said she hoped so too. He told her privately, as the session room cleared, that he had told the younger members of his team something after this was all over. He told them that when a species answers a 12,000-line document with a single word, you should probably find out why they are that confident before you make any more demands. She said that was good advice. Back on Earth, Grace Colton stood her carrier groups down and drove herself to a fishing spot on a river in Montana that her father had taken her to as a child. She spent 4 days there and caught 5 fish, 2 of which she kept. Pete Darrow filed his contingency documents under a folder labeled Resolved and did not open it again. Dana Cole, his aide, asked him once, a few weeks later, if he had ever actually thought the Council would push all the way to a confrontation. Pete thought about it for a moment, then he said he hadn't, really. Not because he thought the Council was reasonable, exactly. More because once you took the time to look carefully at humanity's actual position, the mapped routes, the deep stations, the new alliances in unmapped space, the math didn't really work for anyone who tried to threaten it. The Council had smart people. Smart people could read math. Dana said that was a very calm way to think about it. Pete said that was generally the best way. Owen Briggs went back to Portland and started working on mapping the remaining 29%. He figured he could have it done in 14 months if his team kept up the pace they had been running. He did not think of it as a strategic project anymore. He just liked mapping things. He liked knowing what was out there. The universe was full of dark places that nobody had looked at yet, and Owen found that exciting in a way that was hard to explain to people who weren't also scientists. Though he tried sometimes. Nadia Flores gave one short interview to a journalist from a science publication who had somehow gotten wind of the data document she had co-written. She confirmed that the document existed. She confirmed that it had been presented to the Council. She declined to go into details on the grounds that most of the specifics were still classified, and she went back to her office in San Antonio, where she was already working on 3 other projects. Lieutenant Cal Merritt, the communications officer from Boise, who had intercepted the private Council message on the 3rd day and forwarded it to Laura, received a formal commendation 6 weeks later. He accepted it with the slightly embarrassed expression of a person who felt they had mostly just pressed forward on an email. He told his mother about it on a phone call, and she said she was proud of him, and he said, "Thanks, Mom, it was really not that big a deal." Laura Vane stayed on the station above Kepler 22b. She had more work to do. The new cooperative framework needed to be built out in detail, and that was going to take months of careful conversations, which was exactly the kind of work she was good at. She settled back into her routine. 1 headache pill in the evening, a call home every few days. In the deep archives of the Galactic Convergence Council, in a section that documented diplomatic events of historic note, a record was filed under the heading of the year and the species and the event. The filing clerk, a young Saluan, noted that it was unusual because the response column, the column where the responding species answer was recorded for history, was very short. Most entries in that column ran to paragraphs. Some ran to pages. Humanity's entry was 1 word. The clerk looked at it for a moment, making sure the record was complete. It was complete.